Hello, welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott, program number 63 in our series, The Book of Acts. We are in the 22nd chapter of Acts. We're going to be starting with verse 22. Our first story is titled, Paul and the Roman Tribune. Paul and the Roman Tribune. The second one is going to be Paul before the council, but let me give you a little background first. Paul had been in the temple. Riot had broke out. He was in there to purify himself. The elders at the church of Jerusalem wanted Paul to show to everyone that he was okay, that he was still mindful and obedient to the customs and laws of Moses. But then there were a lot of enemies that Paul had. They knew who he was. Though he had been zealous for Judaism, suddenly that had changed, and Paul was somebody different altogether. He's still called Saul at this point. Paul is the Greek equivalent. And so big mob happens, riot, Paul's beaten. Roman Tribune comes down, rescues Paul. He has an opportunity to speak before the people. And so it's just an incredible time. And so Paul talks about what Jesus said to him, what happened to him, the change. He has an opportunity to bear a witness for what happened to him, which is core evangelism, as we say, core evangelism. So now we're getting to a story where we have Paul before the Roman Tribune. By the way, we know the name of the Roman Tribune. His name is Claudius Lysias, and we're going to get a little bit more of that in a little bit. So we pick up the story now in Acts chapter 22 and verse 22. Up to this word, they listened to him. That is, Paul is speaking. He's on the stairs, just about to enter the barracks of the fortress of Antonia. This big fortress stuck up above the temple. The Jewish people hated it, understandably. The Romans were watching everything they were doing. There was always all kind of mischief underfoot. There had been the Sicarii, the dagger men. That would become a little bit later. And then with the Egyptian messianic figure caused a lot of trouble. There was a lot of confusion that was going on in this period in history. Produced by primarily the Roman occupation and how they had a tendency to control the high priesthood. And so there was always a lot of tension amongst the Jewish people among themselves. And then the whole thing about Jesus that they crucified, and now apparently they're saying he's risen from the dead, and there's so many people, thousands and thousands of Jewish people becoming Christians. That's very difficult for Jewish people. I know this well, and how troubling that is when you are committed to any other religious point of view and you encounter a separate one. You're going to have to deal with it. Now, most of us do this quite successfully, but some, and especially Christianity, is really a big challenge. It's really a big challenge. The easiest thing to do is talk about how crazy the Christians are. Well, that's the easy one. That was my favorite. Those people are crazy. Look at their history. Terrible. Terrible. Of course, a complete misunderstanding of actual Christian history. The details of the history of the church, the organized church, yeah, pretty bad looking. But we know that for long periods of time, people that were not have anything to do with Jesus really had power in the church. It's that way then, that way now. It's just the way that it is. The real church is always invisible. There's a visible church, but then there's the invisible church. Everybody that is a part of Miller Avenue Church is not necessarily a Christian. Our doors are wide open to anybody who wants to come in and stay there as long as they want to. And that's just how that works. And so you never know what real Christianity is. So I don't know how I got off on that. Anyway, They listened to him, and then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, kill him." For kill him is not in the text, that's mine. And then it says, "For he should not be allowed to live." Okay, there you go. I wasn't far wrong. Here you find the cultic mentality. I've had the cultic mentality. I was told so by a major professor in a doctoral program, a PhD, one of the leaders in the understanding of what toxic faith is all about. And he told me that I had one, and I resisted until I found out that he was entirely correct. By God's grace, I was able to take a look at myself and what we were doing, and I saw it, and it was very painful. It is to this day. When you've had that happen to you, and I know that some of you out there listening, watching this, may have had that experience. Once you've been a part of a bad church experience, maybe even very bad, it pretty well ruins you. You know, you're afraid. You don't want to trust anybody else again. I thoroughly understand that. If you're in that place, I empathize with you and identify with you. But we mustn't let that really keep us from being a part of the fellowship of Christ. Anyway, he goes on in verse 23, "And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air." I thought about, where do they get the dust at? They're in the temple area. That I guess it could be dusty. I must have been. The tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging. What? Examined by flogging, to find out why they were shouting against him like this. That was part of Roman ritual, court ritual. Flogging. It was done with long strips of leather attached to a solid wooden paddle, and on the end were pieces of metal or bone, and they were thrown over and ripped, and you would be ripped sometime down to the bone. Many did not survive. This happened to Jesus. This literally happened to Jesus. And it was going to happen to Paul, but it was stopped. So that's what was going on here. They were going to do that. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, now here Paul, he's already been beaten. He's probably bloody already. They stretched him out. Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" Now, whatever might be said for the Roman law, this was still pretty much the heyday of the Roman law system. We have borrowed a great deal from it. There were codes of law, and they were upheld by the courts, and you dare not, they were pretty severe, you dare not go against Roman law. You just dare not do that. Paul was a Roman citizen. He knew that such a thing, a flogging of a Roman citizen, and uncondemned at that, he's not guilty of anything, they're just doing it thinking that this punishment is going to bring out the truth. I suppose it will bring out lies. You'll do anything to avoid the pain, after all, won't we? And so they think they're going to get some kind of a testimony, incriminating testimony out of Paul, perhaps. The Tribune, he doesn't understand. He's not a Christian. He doesn't care anything about Judaism or Christianity or anything. He doesn't know anything about any of it. All he wants is peace in the city. He doesn't want to be sent further into the wilderness, maybe out in the desert in northern Africa to guard some little post. He's fairly comfortable in Jerusalem, and so he's going to do what he's going to do. When the centurion heard this, verse 26, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" Now, it was against the law. It was against the law to claim Roman citizenship, and if you were found not to be, that was the death penalty right then. That was not done. And so Paul would have known that as well. And so here he knows what to say. And maybe the guy says, oh, maybe we've got him now. Maybe we've got him. If he claims to be a Roman citizen and he's not. And so the Tribune, he came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, yes. The Tribune answered, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. Paul said, I am a citizen by birth. Now, there were several ways in which you could become a Roman citizen. I got to read this. It's a little bit too much for me to have memorized. Several ways to become a Roman citizen. One, you could have been rewarded for service. The idea has been floated that perhaps Paul's father or grandfather had rendered some service to the Romans and had been awarded with citizenship. This could have taken place, for example, in the mid-60s BC when Pompey came in and overwhelmed Judea and claimed it for Rome. There were many of the inhabitants of Judea who partnered with, helped out the Roman army, and some were awarded with citizenship. Again, the same thing took place in the 30s with Mark Antony and his revolt against Julius Caesar. Those that helped him, helped Antony, the fellow who married Cleopatra, and people were awarded citizenship. Now, another way was to buy it. Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, who prior to this point, he made a lot of money by offering citizenship to people for a sum of money. It was sort of scandalous, but it's what Claudius did. And when someone paid your way like that, they would be referred to as a sponsor, and often the person would take the name of the sponsor. Now, the Tribune's name is Claudius Lysias. Claudius Lysias. So he bought it probably under the emperorship of Claudius when Claudius was selling them. Of course, in the third way, as was the case of Paul, he was born a Roman citizen. So if he was born a Roman citizen, how did he get it? Well, as a Jewish man, he's probably not born, as a natural lineage. Some relative had to have bought it or have earned it. And we don't know which. Paul does not state, and neither did he have to, but he is one by birth. Now, there's no way of checking. I mean, you're not going to get a Google search up and run Paul's name through it and just check on that, whether it's fact or fake. But they just went with it. So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. You see how it was. I saw a movie. I can't remember what it was. It was about a Roman emperor, and they had a practice called decimation. And if the commander called out decimation, the Roman troops would have to line up. Every 10th man would step forward, and his throat would be slit by man number 9. And on down it went. Dozens and dozens of Roman soldiers killed that way, and they did it automatically. Decimation, you count off, you got to 10, you step forward, you're dead. That's how disciplined these people were. I mean, there was no two ways about it. There was no fooling around in the Roman Empire. That's one of the reasons why they were so powerful and conquered such a large portion of the world at that time. So that's what happened. They were afraid, and immediately, the Tribune himself was also afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. Now, the word realize is a Roman term that meant fully knew. Luke is recording this. He's the one who is giving us this report. And why he used the word fully known, the phrase translated realized here, we are left in the dark. I've tried to imagine out, this is the second time I've had to go through this material, once to preach it at the sermon and now for this program, and I can't understand what it was that could have happened or been said that would have confirmed at the Tribune that Paul was really a Roman citizen. I'd really like to know. All right, second and last story. It's titled Paul Before the Council. Now, the council would be the Sanhedrin, made up of 70 people. They would be Sadducees and Pharisees and some tribal elders, and over them would have been the high priest of Israel. We begin at verse 30. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him, that's Paul, and commanded the chief priest and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set them before them. So where they met, that would have been in the temple area, and what an indignity that these people had to suffer. These barbarian, atheistic Roman, or maybe not atheistic, Roman soldiers with their standards, which they felt were blasphemous to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Here they come down not only into the temple, but into, I think it's called the Hall of Hewn Stone, where the Sanhedrin met. And here you have these Roman soldiers all there, and it would have been a very unpleasant situation for these people. Very humiliating. Chapter 23, verse 1. And looking intently, Paul said, looking intently, the council said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." In other words, I am not against our God. Our God is Abraham, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the creator of the universe, the one who sent the prophets, who anointed the kings. I have lived in good conscience up to this day. And the high priest, Ananias, commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Ananias, there was an Ananias who was a Christian in Damascus. There was an Annas who was the high priest. Actually, he had been a high priest. His son-in-law, Caiaphas, was high priest during the days of Jesus. But this is another Ananias, and he was not considered a good man. He was not well liked. He was appointed by Rome. He was known for his cruelty. He was a real thief. He used to send out temple police during the wheat harvest and collect the wheat harvest before it could be processed or sold or used by the people, and say, "This is your tithe," and just steal it. He was really not liked by the people at all. And he, as I said, he was a cruel man. He was high priest from 47 to 58. When the Jewish war broke out in 66, he was assassinated. He was assassinated because he had been helpful to the Romans, probably struck down by the Sicarii. Later on, his son Eleazar took vengeance on those who had killed his father. But in any case, this was a cruel, wicked man, and who was capable of almost anything, retaining power. He was after power and wealth, and we would say, well, how unusual. Okay. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. The word strike, John MacArthur says, deal a powerful blow. What is it? a vicious blow. MacArthur in his study Bible says, deal a vicious blow. Now, the very same thing happened at Jesus' trial, and I'm going to read this little story to contrast Jesus and Paul a little bit. I'm reading here in John chapter 18, verse 19. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So we're going to see how Paul handles it. It's going to be a little different than what Jesus did. Okay, I got to find my place. Paul said to him, God is going to strike you. God is going to strike you. You whitewashed wall, are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck? Well, Paul's right. He was not to be struck, but he struck a vicious blow on the mouth. And he makes this statement, very un-Jesus-like. And I think that I'm probably more like Paul than I am like Jesus when I read this sort of account. Paul was upset. He was mad. He was angry. That upset him. And, Luke portrays Paul warts and all. Warts and all. There's no attempt to make Paul some kind of angelic figure or anybody a close approach to Jesus. Paul is not that way. He's different. You see, it makes it okay for people that are wild and crazy like I am to still be followers of Jesus and not have to accumulate some kind of guilt and shame when we're not wonderful and perfect. And those who stood by said, Would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was the high priest, for it is written, For you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people, quoting Exodus 22, verse 8. Now, Spencer suggested Paul had bad eyesight. He didn't know it was Ananias. Some said, well, Ananias, because it was an unofficial meeting, he didn't have his priestly garment on. Paul didn't recognize him. Oh, maybe. The explanation I like is it really is irony. It is something that Paul said that he intended to make irony. He well, if you're really the high priest, you wouldn't have had that done. In any case, whichever way you want to look at it. Now, when Paul perceived that one were part Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. Mostly Sanhedrin Sadducees, they had the power. They were the minority numerically, but they had the power. The Sadducees had the majority, number-wise. They had vastly different points of view. The Sadducees only accepted the first 5 books of Moses, the Pharisees all of it. Therefore, they were going to believe in resurrection. Now, when Paul says, with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead, I am in trial, he's going to be referring, and they would know it, to Jesus. Because the Christians have been teaching for almost 30 years that Jesus, though crucified and died and buried, had been risen from the dead. And they would have immediately known this is the crux of the whole thing. And when he had said this, a dissension arose among the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there's no resurrection, nor angel, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledged them all. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes and Pharisees parties stood up and contended sharply, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him?" Well, Paul's very clever. He knew how to divide the group. He knew what the sore point was. And he uses it. And there a sharp division arose. Very clever on Paul's part, wouldn't you say? He said, "We find nothing wrong." Verse 10, "And when the dissension became violent." Now here they are with the Roman soldiers. They're in the Sanhedrin. They're in the sacred area of the sanctuary of the temple. They became violent. Is it any wonder? Does anything go deeper? Does anything rile people up more than what you believe in as your faith? People say religions cause war. We ought not to talk to religions. When they're right, it always causes it, but if you're not going to discuss it, then you're not discussing that which is of significance, of ultimate significance. It means you're mired down into boredom, just talking about the ins and outs of human existence. Something interesting, but not vital and not ultimate. And so the Tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces, that's how outrageous this is becoming, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from among them by force and bring him into the barracks. Well, Paul is having quite a time. His overriding goal is to present his people with the message of the gospel. Now, there were Sadducees and Pharisees. The Sadducees were limited to the law, the Pharisees, the whole of the Hebrew Bible. In the New Testament, we find that Pharisees are converted. We don't find any leading Sadducees belonging to the Sanhedrin converted, although the scripture does have a place where it says that many priests were converted. So these would have been Sadducees or belonging to the Sadducee party in some way. Verse 11. "The following night the Lord stood by him and said, 'Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome.'" Jesus does not rebuke Paul. He does not correct him. He does not try to instruct him. He points him to the major thing. And first he says, "Take courage. Take courage. Be strong and of good courage," we find in Joshua chapter 1. Take courage. As you have testified to the facts, you're going to do so in Rome as well. So long.